Yeah.
And pause.
11 o'clock. We got a lot to talk about. And welcome to All Things Black Politics live here on Boston Black News. I'm your host again, Leon Rock. And I got to tell you, I have a lot to talk about today. I did not bring any guests on because guess what? There's so much to talk about. Excuse the way this is going. I guess, you know, they tell you when you are on a broadcast that you should watch out for the things that you wear. And clearly, I wasn't watching out for the things that I wear. This pink may not be doing well for the background, but that's okay. We'll get through this. Anyway, hello and welcome. Here's the deal. Let's talk about Washington, D.C. first. If you don't mind, we have to come to, yes, Washington, D.C. And in Washington, D.C., something has happened that is pretty amazing. And why do I say that? It's because of something that is actually connected to what I want to talk about later on today, and that is reparations. But before I talk about reparations in Boston, I have to talk about the African leaders that converged here in Washington, D.C. Yes, even during a campaign of right-wing Americans attempting to take over the United States government as a backdrop, the people of, yes, African countries from around the world came here to Washington, D.C. It just broke up yesterday, but it started on Tuesday. And guess what? Lloyd Austin, who is the chief at the Pentagon, and State Secretary Anthony Blinken co-hosted the 3-day summit of African leaders in Washington, D.C. that began Tuesday. The first day of the agenda involved business and finance and healthcare and climate crisis mitigation, space-related developments, and a discussion on defense and security. And guess what? President Joe Biden announced that he is committing to $55 billion in new funding for African nations over the next 3 years. Yes, I said it, over the next 3 years, African nations are going to get $55 billion of our taxpayer money. Yeah, I said it. Of our taxpayer money is going over to Africa. Well, I have no real problems with that because guess what? Money has been going every place else in every part of the world, and it's about time the United States committed to Africa. Oh, by the way, but there's a backdrop to this. Oh yeah, there's a backdrop to why the United States is all of a sudden giving money to the African nation. And that's because China and Russia has a foothold in Africa that is unbelievable. Yes, unbelievable. Everything that is made pretty much in Africa now, just like America, is distributed, made in China and distributed into Africa. Actually, in Africa, more products go to Africa from China than the United States. That's a fact. Oh, so the issue of Africa is on the minds of so many people here in Washington, and there's a reason for it. There's also a reason why in my hometown of Boston, Massachusetts, A decision has been made. Yes, a decision has been made regarding reparations. Did you hear me? A decision has been made about reparations. Oh, by the way, it's a minimalist decision right now. It's a study on reparations for Black Bostonians. And I got to talk about this, if you don't mind. Sorry for the quick segue, but we got a lot to talk about with regards to this whole reparations issue. And by the way, I am not an expert on reparations by any stretch of the imagination. I'm coming from common sense and logic. Yes, I'm coming from common sense and logic. And excuse me for a second, I'm just a little bit under the weather. I think I caught the flu. So bear with me. Here's the deal. The Boston City Council has voted to form a new commission to study how it can provide reparations for and other forms of atonement to Black Bostonians for the city's role in slavery and its legacy of inequality. Oh, by the way, there is a strong legacy of slavery and inequality in Boston. Oh, by the way, and I got friends on the police department. Actually, my late brother, was a member of the Boston Police Department. So don't get me wrong when I say this. And by the way, it's just part of history. The Boston Police Department was established as the first police department in the nation. And the reason why it was created was for slave catching. Yep, you heard me, slave catching. People who were enslaved, Africans who were enslaved, particularly in the deeper of the South, where it was totally brutal. Not saying that it wasn't brutal up in the North, but it was definitely brutal up in the South, down in the South, up South and down South. Well, down South, the folks used to come up and escape. That's a fact in Boston through its city council at the time, and I think they had a different name for it besides city council, alderman or something. They approved of the establishment of the Boston Police Department. They also approved of catching slaves and sending them back to their owners. Yeah, I said it. We were owned. But here's the deal. A progressive Boston City Council voted Wednesday to form a task force to study how it can provide reparations for and other forms of atonement for Black Bostonians for the city's role in slavery and legacy of inequality in a unanimous, get this, unanimous vote. Boston now joins a conversation about reparations that is happening across the country, from Providence, Rhode Island to California. Oh, we're going to talk about California in a moment. Oh, and Rhode Island's in it too. Boston will be closely watched, and there's no question in my mind that Boston will be closely watched given its troubled racial history. Oh, by the way, troubled racial history up until today. Nothing has changed, but everything has changed in my hometown, your hometown of Boston, including its role in supporting and financing slavery, even after Massachusetts abolished the practice in 1783. Did you get that? Massachusetts, can I say it right? Massachusetts abolished the practice of slavery in 1783, but Boston continued. Does that make any sense? Supporters of the reparations cited its history of segregated housing, as well as political economy after emancipation that reduced opportunities for Black Bostonians. Yeah, that's right. Oh, no question about that. The result, they say, is a wealth gap between Blacks and whites that remains today. No question about that either. Oh, by the way, when you talk about segregation in the city, the facts of the matter are still the same. We still got a, in many ways, segregated police department. Oh, why do I say that? Because they continue to have problems meeting their goal of inclusiveness, of making sure that Blacks are on the police department. Oh, let's not talk about the fire department. Oh yeah, they had to be sued. Wait a minute, let's look for a minute. The Boston Police Department had to be sued. The Boston Fire Department had to be sued. The Boston Housing Authority. Oh, by the way, I was involved in that one. Worked with the Boston, Legal Assistance Project to file a lawsuit back in the 70s. Well, early 80s, late 70s, early 80s. That called for the takeover of the Boston Housing Authority because of segregated housing patterns. So you have the police department, the fire department, the public, every agency essentially of government in the city of Boston has been sued for racial discrimination and racial apartheid in the city of Boston. And it continues to happen. Oh, by the way, come on now. We got a good city council, pretty much, predominantly women, yay, yay, and predominantly people of color, yay, yay. This ordinance that they're trying to create is a way, in a long-awaited way, of a necessary conversation, says City Councilor Julia Mejia. Yeah, the city of Boston, she says, like many areas of the United States, has profited from the labor of enslaved African Americans and has further disadvantaged them by barring them from participating in some economic mobility opportunities as their white counterparts. Tanisha Sullivan, president of the NAACP Boston branch, has called the vote an historic, important step forward on what will be a deliberative robust and inclusive process to help our city better understand the role it played in supporting the enslavement of Black people in the United States. Well, 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 is it going to take all that? The history books are clear. Oh, yeah. Phyllis Wheatley. Oh, yeah, you remember her. So many patriots died. The first Black man, the first person to die in the American Revolution was Crispus Attucks. You learned that. We learned that in public schools in the city of Boston. That's a fact. Oh, by the way, lawmakers across the country are pushing their states and cities to study reparations. Study, 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 and more studies. Evanston, Illinois became the first U.S. city last year to make reparations available to Black residents. And public officials in New York will try to essentially create a reparations commission in that state. California has formed a commission to study the issue and is meeting this week to consider what form of reparations could take place and the eligibility requirements to receive possible payments. Oh, I'm interested in these whole issue of eligibility payments. How long do you have had to have been a Boston resident to gain reparations? 1 year, 5 years, 20 years, 30 years? Should you have lived in the city of Boston for a decade, 2 decades, 5 decades? Should your family have roots in the city of Boston for generations? What are the qualifiers of this interest in reparations? Well, in Boston, activists have been calling for years for the city to atone for its role in slavery. The idea of reparations was first proposed back in the 1980s. I remember it. My dear friend, the late brother and Senator Bill Owens, the first Black senator in Massachusetts, who died earlier this year, was a champion of it. Now, today, Reverend Kevin Peterson, an activist here in Boston, founder of the New Democracy Coalition, and a broadcaster here on Boston Black News and Boston Praise Radio and TV, has advocated for reparations for several years and acknowledged that the ordinance wasn't perfect, but that it moves our city forward. Now, my question to you is reparations the solve-all, the best thing that can happen to the city of Boston? What's your thoughts? 301-715-8592 is the call-in number. The password is 748535. Again, 74. in what it needs to do to actually atone for what it put Black folks through since slavery until present day. What should the city of Boston do to atone? Now, this task force in Boston will examine reparations models and study the disparities that have existed in the city as it relates to the African American community. It will also collect data on historic harms to Black Bostonians and hold hearings where it will gather testimony from the community on problems that they have faced. I'm going to tell you right now, I'm going to be up in Boston. I'm coming up to Boston, my good friends. I'm coming up to my hometown because I want to be involved in that conversation about reparations and the historic disparities in the city of Boston. I can talk about my own experience is having gone to the Boston public school system in a segregated school system, a de facto segregated school system back in the 1950s. I can talk about how my grandfather, who came to this country, back in the early 1900s, experienced the segregation and experienced the hate, even though he loved the city of Boston. Just like a majority of Black folks in Boston do, we love the city, but the city has not been very nice to us. The panel will make recommendations for reparations, as well as ways to eliminate policies and laws that continue to cause harm for Black Bostonians. Well, that's a mouthful right there, isn't it? Yeah, it's a mouthful. It will also recommend how the city will issue a formal apology to the people of Boston for the continued perpetration of gross human rights violations and crimes against humanity on African slaves and their descendants. That's a lot right there, isn't it? The time is right for us to begin the process of exploring the mechanisms by which a robust policy of reparations can manifest for Boston's Black community, says Councilwoman Tania Fernandez Anderson in her statement. After centuries of entrenched and embedded structures of institutional racism, by chattel slavery, legalized segregation, redlining, lynching, racist realty practices, and inequalities in education, healthcare, and policing, among other categories, it's clear that the debt owed to the people who have faced this matter. Yeah, there's the debt owed to the people who have faced this matter. And my question to you is, should anyone get it? What is the cutoff point for this whole reparations conversation? Oh, by the way, I agree with the committee. Establishing this committee is a worthwhile strategy. The study of reparations for Black Bostonians is critical. I salute the people that have talked about this for years, including the late Senator Bill Owens and other Black legislators during that time, including Mel King, Doris Bunty, and so many others, Royal Bowling Jr. and Royal Bowling Sr. and Bruce Bowling amongst them. And now the new leadership on the Boston City Council, Julia Mejia, I salute you. Kevin Peterson, founder of the New Democracy Coalition, I salute you. Those folks, that are leading this effort, I salute you. Now the question is, my good friends, what will reparations look like in the city of Boston? Well, hold on and wait a minute. Hold on and wait a minute. In Los Angeles, reparations is real. They created an advisory commission back in 2021. The task force has said that Black folks in California, just a Black person in California, could be owed hundreds of thousands of dollars. Well, the California Task Force on Reparations has begun putting dollar figures to the potential compensation for various forms of racial discrimination, generational pain and suffering of Black Americans, and how they have experienced it in California. Rough estimates by economic consultants may mean that hundreds of thousands of dollars could be due to Black Californians who are descendants of enslaved ancestors. However, some politicians on the task force indicated reparations would be a difficult case to make. Task force member Senator Stephen Bradford, a Democrat representing South Central LA, told an audience of public participants in a meeting in Los Angeles that he would be interested in this issue, but he sees it as a major hurdle to pass reparations plans in the legislature. For the state didn't have slavery, I don't think they were going to be quick of a vote on this final product of the task force, he said. We need to stay unified. We need to be together. We aren't always going to agree, but we have to put on a united front. Well, that's what a representative in California is saying, that we have to put on a united front. A united front, my good friends. Now the question is, can Boston put on a united front? Why do I say this? Why do I say if Boston can put on a united front? It's because Boston tends not to put on a united front when it comes to Black folks coming together. Oh yeah, we put on a united front on Juneteenth, kind of, sort of. We put on a united front from time to time, but when the rubber hits the road, there seems to be a split all the time. How do I come to that conclusion? Well, let's look at the mayoralty races that have happened. Every time for the past two significant mayoralty races, Black folks couldn't come together to decide on making sure that a Black person could win in the general election. That's a fact, my good friends. My question is who's the qualifying individuals, Black folks, that will receive a payment? Again, should you have been in Boston 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years? What is the cutoff date? What is the cutoff time for you as an African American in Boston to receive, in many ways, dollars and cents, because that's what it's all about, isn't it? Reparations is about dollars and cents. When are Black folks going to get this reparation, and who's going to get to them? Is it going to be the Commonwealth of Massachusetts? Or is it going to be the city of Boston? And where is the city of Boston going to get this money from? Where's this? Is it going to get it from the state or the federal government? Is it going to be some type of tax? Is it going to be some type of way of getting these dollars and cents? I'm not sure. But I'll tell you what, something has to happen. Well, wait a minute. I gotta share with you an article that I read about this whole reparations thing. And the article, by the way, is written by a person that sold his business to Viacom. You know who I'm talking about. Robert Johnson, co-founder of BET and RLJ companies. He writes that we know there's starkly different economic realities for Blacks and whites in America in this country, and the solutions have not yet been made a reality. African Americans lag far behind white Americans in all categories of wealth. Well, Boston can say that for sure. More than 73% of white Americans own their homes, while only 44% of African Americans do. Oh, by the way, that's lower now. The median income of white American families is more than double that of African American families. Well, in Boston, forget about it. Boston's median income as you know, from a Boston Globe piece some years ago, is off the chain. And Black folks' median wealth is about $7 or $8. That's the value of the average Black Bostonian. They can't even buy essentially a loaf of bread, because loaf of bread costs about $4 now. So, okay, 2 loaves of bread. Well, Robert Johnson is right on point with this. I didn't like the way he sold BET, but he is very much on point in this article that he wrote. He wrote as well that when you see all these lagging statistics between Blacks and whites, you must ask yourself why it is not that whites are more intelligent, morally superior, or more industrious than, yes, Black Americans, which is the primary sociological attributes that cause people to succeed in life, writes Robert Bob Johnson. African Americans are very industrious. They disproportionately work at some of the toughest and least rewarding jobs in the country. It is not a lack of morality, as African Americans have a deep moral fiber. I confirm that. They firmly believe in traditional Judeo-Christian morality and can be more conservative than whites in many ways. I second that. It's certainly not a lack of patriotism. African Americans have been loyal to this country, have fought in our wars when our rights for which we were fighting for others were denied us, yes, here. This is Robert Johnson speaking. Powerful brother. The only honest conclusion of the question of wealth and income disparity is simply that whites, due to 200 plus years of slavery and systemic racism, had to adjust head start in wealth accumulation, income, and educational opportunities that were denied to African Americans and are still denied in many ways today. Go ahead, Bob Johnson. When you accept that conclusion, the only thing left is to admit and acknowledge that this legacy of slavery is the primary factor in which wealth disparity and racial animosity and discrimination exist. Go ahead, brother Robert Johnson, again. The system of slavery and its aftermath not only denied African Americans the right to accumulate any kind of wealth, but even more detrimental to the human spirit, it convinced African Americans that they were never intended to be economically or socially equal to white Americans. Here. Hey, we should get Bob Johnson up to Boston to speak to this particular issue. Hope they do, actually. One of the first Black billionaires, correct? So guess what? He got something to say. African Americans were left to believe that for them, the American dream in a nation founded on capitalism and the rule of law was nothing but a cruel hoax. Sometimes let me digress for a minute, if you don't mind. When I grew up in Boston, I was an angry Black boy and man. Sometimes I wonder why I was so angry. Was it because of my family upbringing? No. Actually, my family upbringing was Bayesian upbringing. Strong-willed parents, strong-willed grandparents, Bayesian background, strong. So it wasn't that. What was I angry about? I'll tell you what I was angry about and didn't realize it until I grew up. I was angry about the Black experience, my Black experience in Boston. From segregation of the city of Boston schools. My family lived in public housing for a moment over in Orchard Park. Painful. Loved it, but painful. Loved it, but painful. I didn't know we were segregated, kind of, sort of, but I did know that we were segregated, kind of, sort of. I didn't know about no de facto segregation. I just knew that there was something going on where we couldn't go to South Boston, East Boston, Charlestown in safety. So why was I angry? I was angry because of my life experience living in segregated Boston. Oh, when you went downtown, oh, if you went to Newbury Street, oh, you might as well forget it. Actually, probably nothing has changed. Well, as I was talking about this article, written by Bob Johnson, former founder, he's the former head of the BET, but founder of BET. He's mentioning the fact that reparations is so critical to how we address, what we address about racism and slavery in America. How we address slavery in America. Well, hold on and wait a minute. There is more. Bob Johnson writes that I'm calling for reparations and asking for two things. And by the way, this should be something that the Boston Reparation Task Force or Committee takes a look at as well. I'm hoping it will. First, that white Americans recognize that reparations is a payment to atone for the largest illegal wealth transfer in the nation's history. Now, that's what you're talking about, my good friends. Let me state it again. And this is from Bob Johnson from BET. And I hope that Bob Johnson will come up to Boston to share his observations about this issue. Bob Johnson from BET, former head of BET, former founder of, well, not a former founder, but founder of BET, says that he's calling on reparations and asking for two things. Again, first, that white Americans recognize that reparations is a payment to atone for the largest illegal wealth transfer in the nation's history. And second, to understand that the phrases equal justice and economic equity will ring hollow to Black Americans until they are made whole. Hear, hear, Bob Johnson. Now, Bob Johnson has the same concerns that I have. Oh, listen to him. Actually, is Bob Johnson in my brain? Now he says, this is Bob Johnson, how do you implement a massive wealth transfer from white Americans back to Black Americans? The only way to do that is to grant Black people the right to damages in the form of direct cash payment so that they have the financial assets to achieve economic equity within, their own communities and with their white counterparts. Give Black descendants of enslaved people what they would have had and should have had if their ancestors had not been forced to transfer their wealth to white people because of the establishment of government maintenance of slavery, Jim Crow, and discrimination laws for 200 plus years. You know what? I know, legal slavery and the whole 9 yards. Let's put it 402 years. Let's double that. The nation was created 402 years ago. So for 402 years, slavery, in essence, indentured servancy, Jim Crow, and discrimination has destroyed America. No, I just got about 3 or 4 or 5 minutes getting over this cold. Now, Bob Johnson is saying people have asked him how he arrived at that number. He says, and I have to admit that it's mostly math with some justifiable assumptions. Basically, the goal is $14 trillion to close the wealth gap. I don't know about that number either. But let's talk about that because there's more to the article. But I'm not feeling his numbers. He's a number cruncher, but this number crunching just is a cluster failure. Yeah, I said it nicely. The math goes like this. The typical African-American net is $17,000, while the typical white Americans were at $70,000, which is tenfold gap. You want to close the aforementioned gap in ownership, 40% to 70%. You also want to factor income gap, about 25%. Cost of education, the differences in savings and investment. To close the gap with payment over 30 years is going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of $357,000 per African-American citizen. Multiply that by 40 million individuals whose ancestors were enslaved, and you arrive at $14 trillion. How much is the gross national product of Black folks? How much money do Black folks spend in a year? I recollect that it's about $3 to $4 trillion. So if we spend $3 to $4 trillion a year, how did you come up with a $14 trillion figure? That seems low to me. And by the way, this whole issue of giving money to African American citizens who have been impacted by slavery or impacted by discrimination, that's everybody pretty much. Should Africans that move to the United States have access to those dollars and cents too? Should multiracial African Americans get that money too? I moved out of Boston. But my experience in Boston, as I indicated, was traumatic in many ways. De facto segregated school system, de facto segregated housing, segregated police department, segregated fire department, segregated everything. Hey, we couldn't even go to a beach, Carson Beach. Segregated, beaten, because we wanted to go to a beach. Rocks thrown at us because we wanted to have equal educational opportunity. Discriminated against and told that you weren't tall enough to become a Boston police officer. You failed the test that was discriminatory. The same thing with the fire department. And let's not talk about the 17 to 21 people that were teachers in the Boston public school system in the 1960s. Or we could count how many Black folks were on the Boston Police Department in its history. Oh, we got a lot to talk about and more, but I'm not going to talk about it today. I only got 2 more minutes. This is a to be continued conversation. I appreciate you all for sharing this dialogue with me about what is going to happen in Boston regarding the whole issue of making sure that Black folks get what they deserve, get what we deserve. Reparations. Will it happen anytime soon? Probably not. They're going to research this stuff as if it hasn't been researched at Harvard University, MIT, UMass, and every other institution in the greater Boston area for at least 100 years, maybe 50 years, 50 to 100 years. Oh, this reparation issue has been on the top of people's tongue for many a year. I know they talked about the reparations issue during the Niagara movement to create the NAACP. So this has been a conversation whose time has come. The only thing I can say is don't forget, Black folks in Boston, stay united. Stay united. Again, this has been Leon Rock, and this has been All Things Black Politics, live from Boston Black News. I appreciate you all. I will see you next week. Have a good day. Bye.